In the waning light of a golden dusk, the city of Troy sat poised between myth and fate, its walls gleaming like the hardened resolve of its rulers. Far across the Aegean, whispers of beauty and betrayal stirred in the hearts of kings and warriors alike. It began with a contest that mortals could scarcely comprehend, yet the gods watched with an inscrutable hunger for drama. On Mount Ida, a shepherd prince named Paris, destined to be both witness and agent of catastrophe, faced a choice that would tip the scales of history. The three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, offered him promises weighted with desire, power, and wisdom. As Homer would later recount, each goddess sought the golden apple inscribed, "To the fairest," and each sought to bend the mortal world to her will. Paris, guided by the stirring whispers of Aphrodite, chose beauty over empire, love over prudence, and thus sealed the fate of nations. Helen of Sparta, already famed across the known world for her incomparable beauty, became the pivot upon which history turned. In Apollodorus's accounts, her abduction, whether by treachery or by the seductive promise of Aphrodite, was not merely a personal affront to Menelaus, her lawful husband, but a rupture in the fragile network of alliances and oaths binding the Greek world. Her presence in Troy transformed a private betrayal into a war that would span a decade, drawing together kings and heroes from every corner of the Hellenic world. The shadow of destiny stretched far beyond Helen's luminous form. Priam, king of Troy, ruled with a cautious wisdom, aware of omens and portents that spoke of ruin yet hesitant to act on mere whispers. Yet fate is seldom patient. Even as Priam's sons, Paris among them, walked the golden streets, the threads of war began to weave themselves around the city like an invisible net. Diodorus recounts how minor disputes and human passions became magnified when entwined with the divine, the very fabric of Troy trembling under the weight of unseen hands. Across the Aegean, the Greek world bristled with potential champions, each compelled by honor, ambition, and the inexorable pull of oaths. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, had long harbored ambitions that stretched beyond mere defense of Menelaus's honor. The abduction of Helen offered him the pretext to assemble a force unparalleled in scope and ambition. In the halls of Mycenae, the air thickened with the scent of iron, bronze, and the muted clamor of assembling armies. Odysseus, cunning and wary, weighed the dangers of overreach against the moral imperative of loyalty. Achilles, still a youth of unmatched promise, bristled with restless energy, his mother's divine protection a whisper of invincibility in an uncertain world. Each hero, summoned by destiny and oath alike, felt the stirrings of a story greater than themselves, a narrative in which mortal courage and divine interference would collide in ways that neither could fully foresee. Even before the first ship set sail, the world seemed to hold its breath. Omens appeared in dreams and in the flight of birds. Sacrifices offered to temper the gods' anger were scrutinized for hidden meanings. Yet for all the foresight of priests and seers, the course of events was neither predictable nor controllable. As Apollodorus and Homer remind us, it is not merely human pride or desire that drives conflict, but the interplay of divine whim, heroic flaw, and the inexorable momentum of fate itself. The judgment of Paris, Helen's departure from Sparta, and the murmurings of unrest across the Greek cities were but the first tremors of a war that would shake the foundations of the known world. And so the stage was set. Across islands and continents, warriors sharpened their blades, polished their armor, and whispered oaths beneath the watchful gaze of gods and men. Every city-state and kingdom became a participant in a narrative whose end was unknowable, yet whose beginning was marked with clarity. Beauty, desire, and the fragile threads of human loyalty had sparked a conflict that could not be contained. Troy, radiant and doomed, awaited the arrival of a storm it could not yet perceive, and the world held its breath for the clash of heroes, the interventions of immortals, and the unfolding of a tale that would echo across centuries. The horizon burned with the sails of assembled fleets, each ship carrying men whose courage and ambition would soon be tested beyond reckoning. The air was thick with tension, the silence before the first cry of battle pregnant with destiny. As the Greek kings rallied their warriors, promising both glory and retribution, the walls of Troy stood serene yet imperiled, a city poised between memory and myth, between mortal strength and divine caprice. The first chapter of the war had closed, and the second, the gathering of heroes, the promise of glory, and the descent into blood, loomed on the horizon, a wave of inevitability that would sweep across the Aegean, carrying with it the cries of warriors, the whispers of gods, and the first tremors of history's most enduring legend. The call to arms rippled across the Greek world like a storm striking the sea. Messengers rode from citadel to citadel, their voices carrying the summons of Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, whose ambition and sense of duty intertwined in a vision of vengeance and honor. Helen must be returned, the proclamation declared. Yet beneath these words lingered the promise of immortal renown and the perilous allure of glory. Kings and princes alike heeded the call, their thoughts tinged with pride, fear, and the persistent murmur of destiny. Each warrior arrived not as a solitary figure, but as a vessel of expectation, of city, of lineage, of divine favor. In Mycenae, Agamemnon stood amidst the gleam of polished bronze, the clatter of spears, and the murmurs of assembled nobles. His eyes, sharp and calculating, surveyed the men he had summoned, men who would become instruments of his will, yet whose ambition rivaled his own. Menelaus, whose personal honor had been insulted, exuded restrained fury, a quiet storm that promised retribution both precise and devastating. The two brothers shared more than blood. They shared a vision of destiny, a moral imperative that justified the assembling of the greatest army Greece had ever seen. Yet even here, in the heart of their city, doubt and caution whispered in shadows. Could mere mortals contend with the caprice of gods and the inescapable tide of fate? Across the Aegean, Odysseus prepared his ship not with the boastful display of kings, but with the quiet, meticulous mind that would later etch his name into legend. He weighed strategy against valor, cunning against brute force, and the needs of his men against the inexorable currents of prophecy. To Odysseus, the war was a chessboard as much as it was a battlefield, and every warrior a piece whose movement required foresight and subtlety. Homer recounts his reluctance to join the expedition, a desire to avoid death cloaked in heroism, yet the oaths sworn to Helen's retrieval bound him inexorably, illustrating the tension between personal desire and collective obligation that would define much of the conflict to come. Achilles, the son of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, was yet a youth, but even in his untested vigor, he radiated a sense of inevitable greatness. His mother, ever vigilant, sought to shield him from the shadow of mortality that loomed over all heroes. Yet in every glance, in every conversation, the tension between youthful impulsiveness and the inexorable pull of fate shimmered like a blade catching the sun. His prowess promised the Greeks a shield against despair and a weapon to carve destiny itself. Yet as the seers and augurs reminded the gathered kings, his path was a double-edged prophecy. Either Troy would fall by his hand, or he would meet an early and glorious death that would immortalize him. Among the assembled forces, other figures carried stories as compelling and dangerous as their arms. Diomedes, youthful and fearless, sought honor and the favor of Athena, whose divine interventions would later tilt battles in subtle and catastrophic ways. Ajax, the towering son of Telamon, embodied brute strength and unwavering loyalty, a human fortress upon which others could lean in the chaos of war. Nestor, aged yet wise, offered counsel steeped in memory and prudence, the voice of experience guiding the impulsive hearts of youth. Each hero's presence contributed a thread to the tapestry of destiny, weaving a narrative in which personal ambition, martial skill, and divine influence were inextricably intertwined. As preparations continued, the Greeks did not merely gather men, they consolidated culture, faith, and strategy into a single, formidable force. Ships were outfitted for the long voyage across the unpredictable waters of the Aegean, while priests and soothsayers interpreted portents, seeking to align mortal action with divine favor. Sacrifices were made to appease the gods, yet even these rites could not guarantee success. For as Diodorus and Apollodorus both note, The gods' favor is neither constant nor entirely comprehensible. Every hero, every soldier knew that courage alone would not secure triumph. It would take insight, unity, and a measure of fortune to overcome the obstacles that Troy and its own divine patrons would place before them. The alliances forged in this moment were as fragile as they were necessary. Princes who had long lived in tension or rivalry now stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by oaths and mutual obligation. Yet beneath the surface, ambition simmered. Agamemnon's authority was unquestioned in name, yet many warriors bristled at the prospect of serving under another. These tensions would later erupt into conflict, rivalries that mirrored the greater struggle of mortals striving to impose order upon a world guided by capricious deities. Homer, in his epic, captures this duality. The battlefield is a stage for both heroic deeds and human folly, where pride, honor, and the unyielding hand of fate collide in ways that are at once tragic and sublime. And then, one by one, the ships were ready. The fleet stretched across the horizon like a river of polished wood and sail, carrying with it men whose names would echo through time. Warriors of unmatched skill, thinkers of subtle cunning, and leaders whose ambition threatened to match the gods themselves. As the oars cut through the sea, the wind whispered omens both hopeful and dire. Storms would test their resolve, the gods would play their subtle games, and Troy awaited, unaware that the world's greatest assembly of heroes was approaching. The tension in the air was electric, a quiet prelude to the violence that would soon erupt. Every glance exchanged, every whispered strategy, hinted at the dramas that would unfold on distant plains and ramparts. Each man carried within him the promise of glory and the shadow of death. Yet they sailed onward, compelled by oaths, ambition, and the inexorable momentum of destiny. The stage was set, the players in motion, and the narrative of the Trojan War surged forward, propelled by the convergence of mortal courage, divine intervention, and the fragile, luminous thread of fate itself. The Aegean stretched before them, vast and indifferent, its waves glinting like polished steel beneath a capricious sun. From the deck of each ship, the horizon seemed infinite, yet each warrior sensed the weight of destiny pressing upon them. The voyage was not merely a passage of distance, but a trial of endurance and spirit. Storms rose with sudden ferocity, tossing ships like toys in the hands of angry deities. Homer recounts winds that screamed like the voices of the dead, omens that turned calm seas into battlegrounds before the first blow had been struck in Troy itself. In these early days, character was revealed not only in the heat of combat, but in the quiet moments of fear, doubt, and camaraderie. Achilles, restless and impatient, paced the deck of his vessel, his mind torn between anticipation and anxiety. Thetis, watching from the shadows of divine perception, trembled at each wave, aware of the fragile thread connecting her son's life to the inexorable march of fate. Odysseus, ever watchful, navigated not only the treacherous waters but the fragile temperaments of the men under his influence. Every delay, every mishap, every minor injury became a reflection of the challenges that lay ahead, a microcosm of the chaos that war itself would embody. Divine interventions, subtle yet insistent, marked the journey at every turn. Zeus, sovereign of the skies, observed from his throne on Olympus, balancing the scales of favor and wrath. Athena whispered counsel to warriors whose skill she wished to sharpen, while Poseidon stirred the waters, testing the Greeks' endurance and resolve. These early skirmishes with nature were preludes to the battles to come, demonstrating that mortal strength alone could never suffice. Cunning, unity, and attention to the gods' omens would be essential to survival. The first clashes with Troy's outlying allies and scouts foreshadowed the intensity of the war to come. Small raids, reconnaissance missions, and skirmishes along the shore tested both strategy and morale. Homer describes the fierce courage of warriors like Protesilaus, the first Greek to leap ashore and the first to taste death, his fate an early testament to the inescapable shadow of mortality. These initial confrontations revealed patterns that would repeat across the decade. Valor could inspire, but pride could lead to downfall. A single death could ignite chaos. Divine favor could turn the tide at a single, crucial moment. Morale, fragile as it was, became a battlefield in its own right. Letters, messengers, and heralds carried tidings both encouraging and ominous. Troops who had never fought together faced the strains of coordination and the tension between personal valor and collective strategy. Agamemnon's authority, though acknowledged, faced subtle challenges from the likes of Ajax and Diomedes, whose pride and prowess demanded recognition. Homer portrays these moments not as mere disputes but as microcosms of the larger war. Human ambition intertwined with destiny, vulnerable to both hubris and divine manipulation. Even the natural world seemed to conspire in this crucible. Birds of prey circled overhead, storms churned the waves, and omens were read in the shifting tides. Diodorus and Apollodorus both emphasized the interplay of human decision and divine influence in these passages, suggesting that the war's outcomes were never fully in mortal hands. Each small skirmish, each lost sailor, each fleeting victory became a lesson, a subtle calibration of strategy, courage, and caution. Yet it was not only nature or divine will that tested the Greeks. Internal tensions simmered, threatening to fracture their fragile unity. Agamemnon's assertion of command was respected in name but questioned in deed. Odysseus's strategic interventions were sometimes met with skepticism. Achilles' impatience and sense of invincibility created friction among those less confident of their destiny. These interpersonal conflicts mirrored the larger stakes of the war itself, the convergence of mortal pride and divine design, each capable of shaping or unraveling the fragile tapestry of fate. As the fleet neared the Trojan coast, anticipation mingled with dread. The first true encounter with Troy's defenses, even at a distance, left warriors in awe of the city's walls, their grandeur both inspiring and intimidating. Homer emphasizes the psychological weight of this moment. The knowledge that they approached a city defended by skilled warriors and favored by gods weighed heavily on even the bravest. Scouting parties returned with reports of robust fortifications and disciplined troops, reminding the Greeks that their journey, though arduous, was merely the prelude to the trials that awaited them. The first arrows loosed across the water, the first clash of shields against bronze, hinted at the magnitude of the conflict to come. Each action, each decision, resonated with consequences far beyond the immediate moment. The warrior's courage would be tested, alliances would be strained, and divine caprice would manifest in ways both subtle and devastating. These early encounters, small though they seemed, foreshadowed the titanic battles, heroic duels, and tragic losses that would define the war. And yet, even amid the tension, there was a sense of awe, of destiny being shaped with every breath. The Aegean itself seemed to acknowledge the gravity of what was unfolding, its waves a silent audience to the courage, cunning, and folly of men striving to leave their mark on history. Each dawn brought hope, fear, and the certainty that the course of events would not be determined by mortals alone. The gods, ever watchful, continued their subtle interventions, and the stage was set for the moments that would elevate men to legend and remind them, in equal measure, of their mortality. The Greek fleet had survived storms, skirmishes, and the fragile cohesion of ambition. Troy loomed on the horizon, magnificent and unyielding, awaiting the first wave of heroes who would strike upon its walls. The tension, already palpable, was about to ignite into full-scale conflict. In the coming battles, courage would meet strategy, divine favor would clash with human hubris, and the destinies of men and gods alike would intertwine in ways both tragic and sublime. The first taste of blood had been spilled. The war, in its full, unrelenting force, was about to begin. The plains before Troy became a theater of fire, bronze, and blood. The Greeks, their morale tempered by storms and skirmishes, met the Trojan forces with a mixture of precision, fury, and desperation. The clash of shields and the scream of steel echoed across the fields, a sound both primal and tragic, resonating through the hearts of warriors and the ears of gods alike. Homer captures the immediacy of these encounters. Each man was a story, each death a ripple in the vast narrative of fate. The first major battle saw Hector, the champion of Troy, stride forward with unshakable resolve. son of Priam and Hecuba, he embodied both princely duty and warrior ferocity. His presence inspired the Trojan army, his voice cutting through the din of war with commands that fused courage with strategy. Diodorus notes that Hector's skill was matched only by his understanding of morale. He knew that the cohesion of his men was as vital as their prowess with spear and shield. Against him, Ajax, towering and indomitable, carved a path through Troy's ranks, each clash between these titans a study in strength, endurance, and the subtle influence of fate. Yet even as mortals fought, the gods moved invisibly among them, their interventions shaping battles in ways that were at once subtle and decisive. Athena guided Diomedes' hand, allowing him to wound gods and men alike. Apollo shielded Hector, diverting blows and whispering strategy into his ears. The battlefield became a living testament to the interplay between mortal skill and divine favor, a reminder that human courage alone could never fully dictate the outcome. Apollodorus recounts these interventions with a keen awareness of their dual nature. They were both boon and curse, granting victory while sowing seeds of pride, hubris, and inevitable tragedy. Amid the chaos, individual heroism shone like sparks against the darkness. Patroclus, wearing Achilles' armor, stepped onto the field with a mix of bravery and desperation, seeking to turn the tide in favor of the Greeks. His valor was unmatched, yet it drew him into the orbit of fate's cruel design. Hector, seeing the familiar armor of his mortal foe, met him with lethal precision. The duel was swift and brutal. Patroclus fell, and with him fell the fragile balance of hope among the Greek forces. This loss, profound and shattering, ignited a chain reaction that would define much of the conflict to come. Achilles, upon learning of Patroclus's death, was transformed. Grief and rage intermingled, a tempest of human emotion that even the gods could not fully temper. Homer portrays his transformation not merely as vengeance, but as the awakening of destiny, the recognition that the war had entered a new, irrevocable phase. His return to battle was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The sight of Achilles on the field became a force of myth itself, a living embodiment of wrath, skill, and the inexorable pull of fate. The battles themselves were not merely sequences of heroism and slaughter, but intricate contests of strategy, alliance, and endurance. The Greeks and Trojans maneuvered in patterns reminiscent of a deadly game, each commander weighing risk against opportunity, each soldier balancing fear and courage. The walls of Troy, massive and fortified, provided both protection and inspiration, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Every city, every ship, every banner on the field carried meaning, symbols of pride, honor, and lineage, entwined with the lives of men who would never see home again. In these key events, the weight of consequence was immediate and relentless. Lives were extinguished, yet the significance of each death rippled outward, shaping morale, strategy, and the perception of divine favor. Achilles' rampage, Hector's disciplined leadership, and the interventions of gods like Apollo, Athena, and Zeus created a battlefield where human action and divine caprice collided in a spectacle both terrifying and magnificent. Diodorus emphasizes that these events were not isolated. Each clash, each hero's moment of glory or defeat, contributed to the inexorable progression toward tragedy and the eventual fall of Troy. Amid the grand sweep of armies, intimate stories unfolded, moments of bravery, fear, and fleeting humanity. Soldiers whispered to one another beneath the shadow of death. Commanders made impossible decisions that would haunt them for life. Fathers and sons fought side by side, aware that their legacy and mortality were entwined in the same inexorable current. The war was not only epic in scale, but profoundly human in its emotional resonance, a brutal crucible in which character, courage, and fate were tested without mercy. And yet, amid this carnage, the Greek army pressed on, spurred by vengeance, honor, and the memory of fallen comrades. Each battle, each skirmish, and each heroic duel reinforced the pattern of the war. Mortal ambition and skill intertwined with divine will, every action pregnant with consequence, every decision echoing far beyond the immediate moment. The stage was set for tragedy and glory, a panorama in which the deeds of men would be immortalized even as their lives were extinguished. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Bloodied fields bore silent witness to both human heroism and the cruel hand of fate. The death of Patroclus loomed like a shadow over Achilles' heart, the rage of the greatest Greek warrior now poised to unleash devastation upon Troy. The tide of battle, once uncertain, had begun to bend under the weight of vengeance, divine intervention, and the inexorable march of destiny. From this point, the narrative inexorably moves toward the role of the gods and the turning points that would define the final years of the war, where heroism and tragedy are intertwined with divine will, and the fall of Troy becomes increasingly inevitable. From the heights of Olympus, the gods watched, debated, and acted, their interventions threading through the lives of mortals like invisible currents in a turbulent sea. Zeus, sovereign of sky and fate, weighed each action with a mixture of impartiality and personal preference, his decisions resonating across battlefields, councils, and hearts alike. Homer portrays him not simply as a detached observer, but as a subtle orchestrator, whose occasional interjections could redirect the course of battle while reminding mortals that even their courage existed under a higher authority. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, moved among the Greeks with precise purpose, guiding hands, whispering strategy, and subtly punishing pride. She favored Diomedes in early engagements, granting him the rare ability to wound both mortal and divine opponents, a gift that magnified his glory while further entwining human ambition with divine will. Yet her guidance was not without consequences. Each intervention sowed seeds of hubris, tension, and future conflict, illustrating the double-edged nature of divine favor. Aphrodite, the architect of the war's inception, manipulated outcomes in Troy's favor, shielding Paris and influencing key moments where desire and passion redirected mortal decisions. Her interventions were both overt and subtle, reflecting the war's origin in love, beauty, and betrayal. Apollodorus emphasizes that these divine manipulations were not capricious indulgences, but deliberate actions that echoed the moral and narrative logic of myth. The gods, though immortal, are bound by their own desires, rivalries, and codes, making their favor as treacherous as the battlefield itself. The gods' interventions were not limited to acts of aid or protection. They also embodied punishment, retribution, and the shaping of destiny through suffering. Apollo, protector of Troy, unleashed plagues upon the Greek camp, his wrath a reminder that human transgression, whether perceived or real, carries consequences far beyond mortal understanding. These divine punishments destabilized morale, tested leadership, and forced heroes to contend not only with enemy forces, but with forces beyond comprehension. Diodorus notes that the interplay of mortal action and divine will created a war that was as much a moral and cosmic trial as a contest of armies. Even minor deities, nymphs and spirits influenced events, demonstrating the pervasive reach of the divine. Sea gods stirred storms to test fleets, spirits whispered omens and counsel to the brave, and invisible hands shifted the outcomes of single combats, tipping scales where human skill alone might not suffice. Each intervention carried layers of meaning. It could inspire courage, redirect hubris, or set in motion tragedies that would echo for generations. In this way, the gods acted as both participants and narrators, guiding the narrative while leaving mortals the illusion of agency. These divine manipulations shaped psychological as well as physical realities. Soldiers perceived omens in birds, smoke, and dreams. Commanders interpreted visions as guidance or warning. The fear of divine retribution tempered pride even in the fiercest warriors. Homer and Apollodorus emphasize that heroism in this context is inseparable from divine influence. Courage alone is insufficient if gods have decreed otherwise, and even the most skillful mortal can become a pawn in cosmic schemes. The battlefield thus becomes a mirror of Olympus itself, a place where ambition, rivalry, and caprice coexist, and where mortal action cannot be disentangled from divine will. The gods also influenced pivotal human choices, turning moments of hesitation into decisive action, or transforming opportunity into catastrophe. When Achilles' rage erupted after Patroclus' death, it was not merely grief that drove him, but the unseen pressures of the divine. Thetis' counsel, Athena's restraint, and Zeus' ultimate sanction coalesced to shape his path. Each hero's rise or fall Each turning point in battle was both an act of mortal courage and a fulfillment of celestial orchestration, illustrating the intertwined nature of fate and free will in the epic narrative. Even the concept of honor and legacy, so central to Greek heroism, was inextricably linked to divine perception. A hero's reputation could rise or fall based on successes favored or hindered by gods. His decisions were never purely personal, but observed, judged, and manipulated from above. The gods' engagement was a constant reminder of mortality, the fragile thread connecting life, glory, and destiny. This interplay gave the war a rhythm, a sense of inevitability that underpinned both victories and losses, shaping the narrative in a way that felt both epic and inexorably tragic. As the war progressed, the gods' favor shifted unpredictably, reflecting both divine rivalry and narrative necessity. Allies became foes, victories turned to calamity, and the smallest interventions, an arrow diverted, a shield deflected, a vision interpreted, could tilt the balance of battle. The human participants learned that survival depended not only on martial skill, but on sensitivity to these subtle currents, an understanding of the invisible forces that guided fate itself. The role of the gods, then, is inseparable from the unfolding tragedy and heroism of Troy. Mortals act, but the consequences of action are magnified, redirected, or punished according to divine will. This intertwining of human agency and divine manipulation sets the stage for the war's turning points, heartbreak, death, and choices whose weight resonates far beyond the battlefield. The narrative of heroism is inseparable from divine influence, a tension that defines both the glory and the tragedy of Troy. And so the stage is set for the turning points and tragic losses that will define the final years of the conflict. The hand of fate, guided and complicated by divine intervention, moves inexorably, promising devastation and heroism alike. The deaths of beloved heroes, the escalation of rage, and the looming shadow of Troy's eventual fall are now inevitable, their consequences reverberating across both mortal and immortal realms. And so the stage is set for the turning points and tragic losses that will define the final years of the conflict. The hand of fate, guided and complicated by divine intervention, moves inexorably, promising devastation and heroism alike. The deaths of beloved heroes, the escalation of rage, and the looming shadow of Troy's eventual fall are now inevitable, their consequences reverberating across both mortal and immortal realms. The battlefield, once a theater of shifting advantage and strategy, became a crucible of grief and inevitability. Patroclus's death had already sent shockwaves through the Greek camp, transforming hope into anguish and rallying Achilles' wrath like a storm across the plains. Homer captures the visceral intensity of this loss. Grief became action, sorrow ignited fury, and the fragile thread between courage and recklessness snapped under the weight of personal tragedy. The death of a single hero, though small in the context of 1,000 men, reshaped morale, strategy, and the very flow of fate. Achilles' return to combat marked a turning point not only in the war but in the moral landscape of the epic. His fury was a force both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Greeks, galvanized by his presence, surged forward with renewed purpose, while the Trojans faced a seemingly unstoppable tide. Yet Achilles' vengeance, as Homer emphasizes, was as much a curse as it was a boon. Each death he inflicted, each breach in the Trojan ranks, moved him closer to glory, and simultaneously closer to the fate prophesied by Thetis. A life brief but immortalized, a legacy forged in blood and sorrow. Amid these surges of fury, the death of Hector loomed as both climax and tragedy. Standing as the bulwark of Troy, he embodied not only martial skill, but the sense of duty that bound the city together. His duel with Achilles, a meeting of mortal might and divine inevitability, reflected the interweaving of human courage and cosmic design. As Homer recounts, Hector fell not solely to Achilles' hand, but to a combination of skill timing and the subtle orchestration of the gods, reminding all that heroism, no matter how brilliant, is always subject to forces beyond mortal comprehension. The psychological weight of these deaths rippled outward. Priam, Hector's father, felt the collapse of hope and the inexorable encroachment of doom upon Troy. Women mourned, warriors despaired, and city walls that had seemed impenetrable now loomed as fragile symbols of mortality. Each loss was a mirror reflecting both human vulnerability and the unrelenting hand of fate. Diodorus notes that these tragedies were instructive. Heroes are defined as much by their responses to grief and loss as by their prowess in battle. Courage and sorrow coexist inextricably, each amplifying the other. The war's turning points were not only measured in death but in shifts of strategy, morale, and divine favor. The Greeks, once beleaguered by resistance and internal discord, gained momentum as key Trojan leaders fell, yet every victory carried its own cost, deepening wounds both physical and emotional, and binding mortal actions ever tighter to the invisible threads of destiny. Apollodorus emphasizes that these moments, whether triumph or tragedy, were designed to illustrate the fragility of human endeavor when confronted with forces both mortal and immortal. Even minor losses had profound effects on morale and cohesion. The deaths of promising young warriors, the wounding of leaders, and the fluctuating fortunes of battle demonstrated the precarious balance of skill, courage, and fate. Each moment of triumph was shadowed by the certainty that calamity could strike at any instant, a lesson both terrifying and instructive for the assembled Greeks and Trojans alike. Amid the carnage, the gods continued their subtle manipulations. Athena guided maneuvers, Apollo shielded survivors, and Poseidon tested fleets and foot soldiers alike. Divine favor shifted with unpredictable rhythm, amplifying victories, punishing arrogance, and reminding mortals that no battlefield decision existed in isolation. The deaths of key figures, Hector, Patroclus, and others, were both human tragedies and expressions of divine will, emblematic of the interwoven destinies that defined the war. In these moments of loss, heroism took on a reflective dimension. Courage was not simply action, it was endurance under grief, decision under uncertainty, and the capacity to maintain honor while witnessing the collapse of all around. Each hero, each warrior, was bound to the tragic inevitability of fate, their lives and deaths resonating with both immediate consequence and enduring mythic significance. The war as it advanced became a study of mortality, legacy, and the profound cost of both glory and vengeance. The turning points of the war also shaped the moral and emotional landscape of the narrative. Achilles' wrath, Hector's fall, and the deaths of countless others illustrated the tension between human ambition and divine orchestration. Soldiers were forced to reconcile their desire for honor with the fragility of life. Leaders had to balance personal pride with collective survival. The battlefield became a crucible not only for action but for character, revealing both the nobility and the vulnerability inherent in mortal striving. As the Greek forces pressed forward, the shadow of Troy's eventual fall grew ever larger. The city, once confident in its defenses and guided by the valor of its champions, now faced an inexorable trajectory of loss and vulnerability. Fate, divine and human alike, had begun to tighten its grip. The stage was set for the war's final act. The cunning strategies, tragic choices, and devastating consequences that would culminate in the fall of Troy and its aftermath, where heroism, deception, and divine influence converge in the epic's most profound moments. The city of Troy, once radiant with the pride of kings and the courage of its defenders, now trembled under the weight of inevitability. Walls that had repelled countless assaults emboldened by Hector's valor and the favor of Apollo, now seemed fragile in the shadow of Greek ingenuity. The war's final chapter was not written in straightforward combat alone, but in strategy, subterfuge, and the cruel calculus of human ambition. Odysseus, master of cunning and subtlety, conceived the plan that would tilt destiny in the Greeks' favor. The idea of the wooden horse, a vessel of deceit disguised as tribute, was not mere trickery but a reflection of the complex interplay of human intellect, desperation, and divine suggestion. Homer presents this moment as both brilliant and ominous, triumph achieved not only by force of arms but through guile, highlighting the ambiguous morality of war itself. The Greek stratagem required patience, coordination, and the willingness to exploit the Trojans' own confidence, revealing how strategy could achieve what brute strength alone could not. The Trojans, weary from years of battle, interpreted the horse as a symbol of victory and an omen of Greek surrender. Priam's counselors debated its significance, torn between caution and the seductive allure of apparent fortune. Cassandra, blessed or cursed with prophetic vision, warned of the deception, her words disregarded by those who feared truth more than danger. Apollo's divine gift of foresight, filtered through human skepticism, thus amplified the tension between knowledge and action, illustrating once more the tragic interplay of divine will and mortal choice. On the night of Troy's downfall, the Greek warriors emerged from the horse silent and lethal, their presence a stark reminder of the war's human cost. Gates, once fortified against invaders, opened to deceit. Watchmen, once vigilant, were overpowered by surprise, and the city, proud and resilient for 10 long years, fell into chaos. Homer emphasizes the horror and intimacy of this destruction. Families torn apart, defenders slain in homes and streets, and the once sacred spaces of Troy transformed into theaters of slaughter. The culmination of strategy, divine influence, and human desperation reshaped the city into a landscape of tragedy and irreversible consequence. In the ensuing carnage, the roles of heroes and kings were amplified. Priam, confronted by Achilles, begged for mercy in the shadow of fate and divine orchestration. Achilles, driven by grief, rage, and the memory of Patroclus, struck with both sorrow and brutality. The narrative intertwines personal vengeance with the inexorable movement of destiny. Each act of heroism or cruelty resonates beyond the immediate moment, demonstrating the fragile boundary between human choice and predestined consequence. The aftermath extended far beyond Troy's walls. Survivors were scattered, captives enslaved, and the city's wealth plundered, leaving an indelible mark on Greek and Trojan memory alike. Yet the war's lessons were not confined to material loss. Cultural, moral, and psychological legacies endured. The heroism of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus, and the tragedy of Priam's sons became enduring symbols of both human potential and vulnerability. Apollodorus and Diodorus emphasize that the story of Troy functions as both history and myth, a record of martial achievement and a moral reflection on pride, ambition, and divine interplay. Even after the city's fall, the war's consequences continued to ripple across the Greek world. Survivors returned home changed, bearing the scars of battle, loss, and divine influence. Some found glory, others despair. Some ascended to legend, while others perished in the aftermath. The war reshaped alliances, challenged moral expectations, and highlighted the precariousness of human endeavor in a world governed by both ambition and the capricious favor of the gods. The fall of Troy, then, is more than a military victory. It is a meditation on the convergence of human ingenuity, courage, and divine influence. Each act, whether heroic, deceptive, or tragic, contributes to a narrative that examines the costs of ambition, the power of intellect, and the inevitability of mortality. The city's destruction, while complete in its physical sense, lives on in memory and myth, offering lessons in both strategy and morality for generations that follow. As the fires of Troy burned, the surviving heroes and witnesses turned toward the uncertain future. Their fates, entwined with divine favor, personal ambition, and the fragile bonds of human society, remained unresolved, hinting at journeys yet to be undertaken, stories yet to unfold. The war had ended in devastation, yet it had also produced immortality. In song, story, and memory, the heroism, cunning, and tragedy of Troy would endure forever. In this reflection, the Trojan War closes its first grand cycle, a testament to human courage and folly, divine influence and inevitability, and the enduring power of story. The echoes of burning walls, fallen heroes, and irrevocable choices resonate across time, inviting contemplation, awe, and the recognition that even in destruction, legend is born. In the waning light of a golden dusk, the city of Troy sat poised between myth and fate, its walls gleaming like the hardened resolve of its rulers. Far across the Aegean, whispers of beauty and betrayal stirred in the hearts of kings and warriors alike. It began with a contest that mortals could scarcely comprehend, yet the gods watched with an inscrutable hunger for drama. On Mount Ida, a shepherd prince named Paris, destined to be both witness and agent of catastrophe, faced a choice that would tip the scales of history. The three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, offered him promises weighted with desire, power, and wisdom. As Homer would later recount, each goddess sought the golden apple inscribed "to the fairest," and each sought to bend the mortal world to her will. Paris, guided by the stirring whispers of Aphrodite, chose beauty over empire, love over prudence, and thus sealed the fate of nations. Helen of Sparta, already famed across the known world for her incomparable beauty, became the pivot upon which history turned. In Apollodorus's accounts, her abduction, whether by treachery or by the seductive promise of Aphrodite, was not merely a personal affront to Menelaus, her lawful husband, but a rupture in the fragile network of alliances and oaths binding the Greek world. Her presence in Troy transformed a private betrayal into a war that would span a decade, drawing together kings and heroes from every corner of the Hellenic world. The shadow of destiny stretched far beyond Helen's luminous form. Priam, king of Troy, ruled with cautious wisdom, aware of omens and portents that spoke of ruin, yet hesitant to act on mere whispers. Even as his sons, Paris among them, walked the golden streets, the threads of war wove themselves around the city like an invisible net. Diodorus recounts how minor disputes and human passions became magnified when entwined with the divine, the very fabric of Troy trembling under the weight of unseen hands. Across the Aegean, the Greek world bristled with potential champions, each compelled by honor, ambition, and the inexorable pull of oaths. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, had long harbored ambitions that stretched beyond mere defense of Menelaus's honor. The abduction of Helen offered him the pretext to assemble a force unparalleled in scope and ambition. In the halls of Mycenae, the air thickened with the scent of iron, bronze, and the muted clamor of assembling armies. Odysseus, cunning and wary, weighed the dangers of overreach against the moral imperative of loyalty. Achilles, still a youth of unmatched promise, bristled with restless energy, his mother's divine protection a whisper of invincibility in an uncertain world. Each hero, summoned by destiny and oath alike, felt the stirrings of a story greater than themselves, a narrative in which mortal courage and divine interference would collide in ways that neither could fully foresee. The call to arms rippled across the Greek world like a storm striking the sea. Messengers rode from citadel to citadel, their voices carrying the summons of Agamemnon, whose ambition and sense of duty intertwined in a vision of vengeance and honor. Kings and princes alike heeded the call, their thoughts tinged with pride, fear, and the persistent murmur of destiny. Each warrior arrived not as a solitary figure but as a vessel of expectation, of city, of lineage, of divine favor. In Mycenae, Agamemnon stood amidst the gleam of polished bronze, surveying the men he had summoned, men who would become instruments of his will yet whose ambition rivaled his own. Menelaus, whose personal honor had been insulted, exuded restrained fury, a quiet storm that promised retribution both precise and devastating. Across the Aegean, Odysseus prepared his ship not with the boastful display of kings but with meticulous calculation. He weighed strategy against valor, cunning against brute force, and the needs of his men against the inexorable currents of prophecy. Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, radiated inevitable greatness, a force of youthful energy tempered by divine oversight. Each hero, each commander, carried within him the promise of glory and the shadow of mortality, bound to oaths, ambition, and fate. Ships were readied, sacrifices offered, and omens scrutinized. The fragile alliances between ambitious princes, warriors, and kings threatened to fracture under pride, yet the collective purpose held firm. Troy must fall, Helen must be returned, and honor restored. The Greek fleet stretched across the horizon like a river of polished wood and sail, carrying men whose names would echo through time. Warriors of unmatched skill, thinkers of subtle cunning, and leaders whose ambition threatened to rival the gods themselves. The stage was set. The first tremors of history's most enduring legend were felt in every whispered strategy, every tightening of armor, every anxious glance toward the sea. The Aegean itself became a crucible. Storms lashed ships, omens appeared in birds and tides, and the first skirmishes tested the Greeks' coordination, morale, and courage. Patroclus, Protesilaus, and other young warriors tasted blood, some for the first time, illuminating the fine line between heroism and mortality. Divine favor interwove with human skill. Athena guided Diomedes, Apollo shielded Hector, and the gods' capricious interventions reminded mortals that no strategy, however brilliant, could succeed without consideration of forces unseen. The plains before Troy erupted in battle. Hector's disciplined ranks clashed with the Greek phalanx, and individual heroism shone amid the chaos. Patroclus fell to Hector, a loss that reshaped the Greek camp and ignited Achilles' wrath. The hero's return to combat was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a living force of vengeance, grief, and divine sanction. Mortal skill met divine intervention at every turn, with gods shifting the tides of war subtly or catastrophically. Each duel, each death, resonated far beyond the battlefield, illustrating the interplay of courage, strategy, and fate. As the war progressed, the gods' invisible hands shaped destiny. Athena guided, Aphrodite shielded, Apollo punished, and Zeus balanced their interventions with inscrutable purpose. Mortals acted, yet each action was magnified, redirected, or punished by divine will. Heroism, then, became not only physical courage but endurance under grief, wisdom in strategy, and resilience against forces beyond comprehension. The turning points, the deaths of Patroclus, Hector, and countless others, revealed the war as a moral and cosmic crucible, a test of both character and fate. Finally, after a decade of struggle, Troy's fall was orchestrated not by brute strength alone, but by cunning. Odysseus' wooden horse deceived the Trojans, while Cassandra's warnings went unheeded, amplifying the tragic tension between foresight and human error. The Greek warriors emerged under night's cover, and Troy, once impregnable, fell to slaughter and fire. Priam perished before Achilles' blade, families were torn apart, and the city's wealth and memory were consumed by war. Yet from destruction arose immortality. The deeds, courage, and folly of heroes were enshrined in song and myth, lessons of ambition, pride, and divine influence echoing through the ages. The survivors dispersed, bearing scars and stories alike. The Greeks returned home altered by loss, triumph, and divine caprice. Troy's fall, while a military victory, resonated as a meditation on mortality, honor, ingenuity, and the fragile interplay of human and divine action. The epic of Troy closes not merely with destruction, but with reflection. Heroism and folly, vengeance and grief, strategy and destiny, all converge to produce a legend that endures across time, immortal in its power, caution, and splendor.